the really exciting part here is, for the first time, Alzheimer's is now optional. Nobody needs to get this disease. We typically find 5 to 10 different contributors, sometimes even more. So you have these different contributors, and the great news, you can fix them. You can see them coming for years ahead of time if you know what to look for. And the problem is that doctors are still practicing this old-fashioned way where they wait for you to have the symptoms and then say, oh, you're in relatively late stage. We now have early tests for future Alzheimer's disease. Your generation is the first generation that should not have to worry about cognitive decline, which is so comforting. My generation, that was the big issue. Are you going to lose your brain? Are you going to lose your ability to think and to remember? You can stay sharp for your whole life. So things have changed. That's the first piece, that you now can make sure that you don't have it. Second thing is...
Hey legend, in today's episode we talked to Dr. Dale Bredesen, who is a neurologist, he's a doctor, he's a best-selling author, and he consults to some of the biggest companies in the world about how to reduce their sugar content, because his expertise is in neurodegenerative diseases. It's a tongue twister, say that 10 times fast, but he is an absolute expert in this area. And he talks to us today about how to enhance our cognitive abilities, how the bacteria in our mouth and our gut can actually pass into our blood and get into our brain, so avoiding that trap, and also how we can use our bacteria in our mouth and our gut to enhance our cognitive abilities, but also how to use food so that we don't fall down a slippery slope and we can actually be the first generation that completely avoids cognitive diseases. So listen to this episode. It's absolutely fantastic. This guy's super passionate about what he does. He's healthy, he's fit, he's in his 70s and just absolutely crushing it. A huge inspiration, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Dale, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to jump in the deep end here, and I really appreciate you being on with me tonight.
Great to see you, Josh.
I mean, you are really passionate about this. You've done incredible work. Like, you're an MD, you're an expert in neurodegenerative diseases. Sorry, tongue twister for my Australian laxative mouth. And you know, you've founded the Buck Institute, founded ADNN. Like, where did all this passion for this come from and this drive?
Yeah, you know, when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman at Caltech, and actually shortly thereafter went to work at MIT with Professor Mark Wrighton, and just an amazing guy. But when I was 18, I read a book that was called Machinery of the Brain, and it was by Dean Wooldridge of Thomson Ramo Wooldridge fame. And very interesting guy. And what he wrote about was the relationship and the similarities between how computers work and how your brain works. And there are some similarities, but there are also some quite striking differences. And it just was so fascinating to me to see how the brain worked. And I thought, man, you know, I kind of got hooked for my whole life on how does the brain work? How does it do what it does? How does it remember things? And so then I ended up deciding to learn more about brain diseases. And the really depressing part was that when I learned about brain disease, I realized this is the area of greatest medical failure. We don't have treatments. And so people tell you, oh, Josh, you know, you got early frontotemporal dementia, you're going to die. There's nothing we can do. Or, oh, Josh, you got ALS, there's nothing we can do. Or you got Alzheimer's, there's nothing we can do. As people say, everyone knows a cancer survivor, no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. So I was interested, and I saw these people around me at Caltech and MIT who were solving these remarkably interesting problems. You know, things like, what is dark matter? Although that one hasn't been solved yet. When I first arrived in college, there was still an argument about whether there were black holes. Look how far that's come. There were arguments many, many years later on, are there gravity waves? And gravitational waves, and look, that's now been solved. In fact, now they're looking for massive ones and claiming to find evidence of ones from, not just from smaller black holes merging, but from these massive, massive black holes at the centers of galaxies. So I was fascinated by, well, what do we do if this is an area where there's nothing to offer? How do you solve that problem? How do you get it started? And so we spent 30 years in my laboratory answering that one question: what drives the neurodegenerative process? And then back in 2011, we realized, okay, we have a model now based on all this research. We don't know if the model's correct, but the model makes very clear predictions about what we should be doing. And by the way, it also says how we can take normal cognition and make it better, which we should all be doing. Most of us, we're feeling like we're pretty normal, but in fact, we could be doing better if we address metabolic issues, toxic issues, etc. So we actually, I saw the first patient back in 2012, April of 2012. She came to the Buck Institute. This is a woman who worked for the CIA and was having dementia, was actually, her mother had passed away with Alzheimer's. Her doctor told her, you have the same thing. She was struggling with trying to complete her tasks and things like that. It was really tough. And she was going to commit suicide, which is why her friend sent her to me. I was not seeing patients then. We were working on transgenic mice, fruit flies, and cells to model Alzheimer's disease. And so I said, oh, well, okay. What's that?
The stakes were high.
Exactly. So I said, look, we haven't treated our first patient yet because we had been turned down for the first trial because they wanted the trial to be one treatment. And we're like, no, it's not that simple of a disease. You have to look at all the different things. It's a network insufficiency ultimately. And so I said, look, we can talk, take this back to your doctor back in Washington, D.C., which she did. We spent 2.5 hours. She took copious notes because she couldn't remember much, took it back to her doctor. And then, surprise, 3 months later, I got a call from her at my home on a Saturday. I almost said, how'd you get my home number? But I thought, okay, the CIA, they know my home number. So, so I got this call and she said, I can't believe it. I'm better than I've been in 20 years. My memory is great again. I'm able to work full time again. Now, here's the interesting thing. I just had lunch with her a week ago. She is now 79 years old. She's doing great. She has sustained her improvement for over a decade. And she just did a 100-mile bike ride and bike race in 7 hours. I mean, she wasn't going super fast, but she's 79. I mean, it was amazing. And she did it in about 7 hours plus. So, just great to see how well she's done. She is now a brain health coach. She was actually part of the book I wrote, which is called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. 7 different people wrote their stories. And I have to say, if you read that and you don't get a little choked up on some of those stories, then you're probably a little too tough because the stories are amazing. People talking about watching their parents die with Alzheimer's and then getting the symptoms themselves and looking at their children and realizing, uh-oh, and then completely turning things around and doing really, really well. So it's just, it's so exciting to see. And so that's why I'm passionate about it, because we've gone all the way since the mid 70s when I was in college from how does this brain disease work? How does the brain work? To what is driving this problem that's been insoluble for years, to now seeing people actually get better and now seeing them stay better. So it's been really exciting to see all these things. And so, yeah, I'm absolutely passionate about it.
That's incredible. Wow. How did that feel when you sent her back? Like, you had that 2-hour conversation with her and then you sent her back to the doctor and you were like, fingers crossed, I hope it works. Or were you feeling confident, or what was your...
To be honest, I thought I would never hear from her again because we had been turned down for the trial. In fact, the trial was going to be done in Australia. Because there was a drug as part of the trial, and you could get that drug in Australia, but not in the U.S. But unfortunately, the Australian boards for review boards, the IRBs, both the public and private, turned it down, so we weren't able to do it. And then, ironically, a couple of the doctors who were on the boards then called us and said, "Well, we'd still like to use it for our patients. Could you tell us how to do this?" And I was like, why didn't you approve our trial? So in any case, so I was so depressed about that when they turned it down. I'm like, what are we going to do now? And the people who actually had given money to do this trial were really angry. It's like, how do you not get your trial? We just have given you money to do this trial. How do you not get it approved? And I'm like, this is the way medicine is right now. They're looking for simple things, and this is a complex problem. They're looking for a checkers solution for a chess problem. And so when, I didn't think I'd hear from her again. And so when I heard from her, my jaw dropped. I put down the phone. I looked at my wife, who's an integrative physician, who's actually taught me a lot about integrative medicine. And I said, I can't believe it. We were on the right track all these years. And so then we started getting more people coming. I started talking about this at meetings. And of course, the usual pushback, we don't believe it. Nobody can get better. We still hear this all the time. Nobody can get better from Alzheimer's, but we're seeing it every day. We now have, over 1,000 people who have done very, very well. And we published, multiple papers. You can read those. They're all freely available online.
Yeah. So what were your next steps in, like, did you just double down, and then how did you, because I imagine, like you said, you got some resistance from medical boards and that sort of stuff. How did you push through that to get to that next level of acceptance, or did you just kind of keep working with individuals?
Yeah, so what we did was we knew that we'd already gotten turned down for the trial. So we said, all right, let's publish at least some cases. Let's at least put the first 10. So first we published 10 cases, 9 of them had gotten better. Then we published 10 more cases where there was more documentation of improvement. We just basically were kind of inching along. We published the next 10 cases actually in 2016. The first one's 2014, then 2016. Then in 2018, we published 100 cases with 15 different clinics we started training people, and actually it was great. There were a lot of physicians from Australia and health coaches from Australia. They were really early in. I really give them great credit. They were right there. And they've continued to do this. Dave Jenkins and so many others, great physicians from Australia who have been doing this. And then what we did was, after we thought, okay, now we have over 100. Let's go back and see if we can now get it approved, because now we got a lot of data. So we went back and they said no again, which was incredible. But so then that was 2019. So finally it got approved like late 2019. We started a trial. We just did the first proof of concept trial and published that last year. It's in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. And again, it's available online. In that was the group I mentioned, 84% of the people actually improved their scores. They didn't just slow their decline. And that's an important distinction. We hear all the time about success with cognitive decline. And what they typically mean is you went downhill a little more slowly. Well, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for you got better and stayed better. And that's what we're seeing. The other common thing you hear is, we did this with 100 people, and as a group, they got slightly better. Well, see, that doesn't help a single person. That helps the group. But you want something where you can tell each person when he or she comes to you, your chance of actually improving your cognition is very good. And that is a far cry from just slowing the decline or from saying, yes, there's a population effect, but not much of an effect on a given person.
We started having a quick little conversation before we were recording, and I'd love to know, what are you most excited about coming up in 12 months?
Yeah, I'm most excited about the fact that, the world is going to change. There hasn't been any place to go, as you know, if you've got neurodegenerative disease. You go to a doctor who tells you, you got Alzheimer's, we don't know why you had it. They give you a drug. They say you're going to die despite the drug. It's been a real disaster. And then the same sort of thing for frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body disease, just go on and on. So we're now setting up the first precision medicine program for neurodegenerative disease in the world. And this is going to be at Pacific Neuroscience Institute. Very excited to be working with Dr. David Merrill and Dr. Dan Kelly and just building this first program so that people from all over the world will have hope, whether they have macular degeneration or ALS or frontotemporal dementia or Lewy body disease or Alzheimer's disease. There's so much that can be done. And we now know with these precision medicine protocols, we can do so much more than what has been done in the past.
Wow. And could you elaborate on what the clinic is and what that means from a layman who has no idea?
Absolutely. So this will be a precision medicine clinic. What that means then is when you come in with any complaints, whether it's, whether you've got weakness and maybe you may have ALS, whether you're having changes in vision and you may have macular degeneration, whether you have visual hallucinations and you may have Lewy body, or whether you are having some memory problems or other executive dysfunction problems and you may have Alzheimer's. For any of these things, they are a degenerative process. And what our research showed over the years is that all of these share one thing in common. They have neural subnetworks that have a supply and a demand. And if the supply is too low and the demand is too high over a period of time, of course, not surprisingly, they will start to atrophy, and that's been the problem. So you need to look now, and so this is what hasn't been done in the past. You need to look at larger data sets. You need to be looking at not just the genetics, but the epigenetics, the biochemistry, so you can actually tease out what is driving the process. And we see in some people where there are contributors from mycotoxins, some from organic toxins, some from inorganic toxins, some from chronic undiagnosed infections, some from metabolic changes, some from sleep apnea. You just go right down the list. There are dozens and dozens of things that can contribute. And unfortunately, the standard of care is you don't even look for those. So in fact, this new approach is going to be now, we will look carefully at all these. And we have tremendous examples, and we've published a number of these. In our trial that we published last year, it's freely available online. 84% of people with Alzheimer's actually improved, which is unheard of. We're just publishing another paper showing improvement that is sustained for over a decade. Again, another thing that hasn't been done in the past. So I think this is an exciting time for all of us for brain health.
Wow. And correct me if I'm wrong, when I think of Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative diseases, I think of older people. I think of my parents. Yeah. I think of people in their 40s and 50s. If I'm 30, should I be thinking about this?
Yes, and let me tell you why that's changed. So when I was being trained way back in the 1980s, we never saw anybody who was young with Alzheimer's. We would see it. We thought of it as a disease of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We now know that, first of all, this is something that starts 20 years at least before a diagnosis, because we can pick up changes in PET scans and changes in spinal fluid 20 years ahead. So this is really a disease that in some people starts in their late 20s, 30s, 40s, and really you're seeing it diagnosed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The good news is the tests are getting better and better. So we should all know, just like Josh, I'm sure you know your cholesterol. I'm sure you know your LP little a, your basic lipid panel. You probably know your HDL to triglyceride ratio, these sorts of things. Your LDL particle number, you may know. But the question is, do you know your p-tau 181? So here's a simple blood test, just became available. We should all know our p-tau 181. Why? Because it'll tell you, even in your 30s and 40s, whether you are headed for Alzheimer's. Now, if it's normal now, great. Recheck it in 5 to 10 years. Make sure you're doing okay. Because as it now starts to rise, what that's telling you is your brain is now starting to go on that pathway. And if you wait over a long period, it's harder, as you know, it's harder and harder to get things back completely. But so the really exciting part here is, for the first time, Alzheimer's is now optional. Virtually nobody needs to get this disease if you get on active prevention. We recommend everyone, we usually say 40 and above, but for people who have any family history, I would go to 35 and above and just get tested, get checked out, see where you stand. Are you at the beginning of the process? And if so, what are the things that are driving this? We typically find 5 to 10 different contributors, sometimes even more. So you have these different contributors, and the great news, you can fix them. So with all of these complex chronic illnesses, neurodegenerative diseases, cancers, cardiovascular disease, you can see them coming for years ahead of time if you know what to look for. And the problem is that doctors are still practicing this old-fashioned way where they wait for you to have the symptoms and then say, oh, you're in relatively late stage of this disease or that disease. Just as, look, pap smears changed the world for cervical cancer. Chest x-rays changed the world for lung cancers, especially if you can get it early enough. It's the same story now. We now have early tests for future Alzheimer's disease. And just as we now look at pre-diabetes and pre-pre-diabetes, which again, many 20-somethings, even children now, often have pre-diabetes and even type 2 diabetes, which was unheard of, 30 years ago. So things have changed. That's the first piece, that you now can make sure that you don't have it. Second thing is, if your parent is in a nursing home or has had a problem, or you have a family history, please get evaluated early, get on active prevention. You don't have to worry about it. Your generation is the first generation that should not have to worry about cognitive decline, which is So comforting. My generation, that was the big issue. Are you going to lose your brain? Are you going to lose your ability to think and to remember and things like that? And then, as I said, there are new tests. Another good test, GFAP, that has not become commercially available yet, but it should be commercially available within the next 6 to 12 months. So you'll be able to now say that's even an earlier one. It's less specific than p-tau 181 or p-tau 217, but it is more sensitive. So if your GFAP is looking good, your astrocytes are good, your brain is probably doing pretty well. But if it's starting to trail up a little bit, then your astrocytes are reacting to some insults. And we can look at these insults, we can identify them, we can address them so that you never have to worry and you can stay sharp for your whole life.
Wow, incredible. Would you mind giving us a quick snapshot of kind of like, are the models different that you use for people who are experience cognitive decline versus if you would suggest someone who's wanting to improve and doesn't already have symptoms, or are they the same?
Yeah, so they're actually quite similar because it's those things, what's happening is those things that would ultimately drive you, for example, long COVID, that would ultimately drive you to cognitive decline are the ones that are weighing you down on a daily basis. I mean, you can think immediately of some simple ones. If you don't sleep, that actually affects your cognition, for the next day at least. And so, of course, a beautiful book, Why We Sleep by Professor Matthew Walker on that. And but there are dozens and dozens of these things. So it's important to know, where do you stand with your various toxins, your inorganics, your organics, your biotoxins? Where do you stand with chronic infections? People will notice, it's interesting, you can even do the neurophysiology, and you can see day to day, up and down, depending on what you've done, what you've been exposed to. We often don't realize how much our cognition is impacted. And of course, everybody wants better cognition. That's how you're going to do your job better. That's how you're going to do things more quickly. That's how you're going to come up with more brilliant ideas. That's how you're going to get ahead. And to some extent, that's what you're already doing by exercising, by getting the sleep and all these. But the thing is, many people don't realize that you're exposed to certain things that are dragging you down. So knowing about those, finding them, and addressing them is really important.
What are the kind of like most common that you see that people aren't aware of?
Yeah, great point. So the most common things that we see, number one is metabolic syndrome. So you see people who have insulin resistance even in their teens and 20s. And what happens, this is how that really affects you. It's such an important issue here. So your brain requires one of two things for its metabolism. As you know, you got to burn something, right? You've got to either burn glucose or you've got to burn ketones. And what happens is when you develop insulin resistance, you lose both of those. So even though you may be young and you may be smart, you're not going to be functioning as well as you should. And what happens is, as you are exposed, and it's processed food and it's high carb and high simple carbs and things like that, that drives your insulin up. You now develop insulin resistance, the signaling downstream from IRS1, which is the signaling molecule that interacts with the insulin receptor. Now that changes its phosphorylation. Literally, it's responding to this chronically high insulin level. And by the way, one of the degrading enzymes for insulin also degrades amyloid. So it does one or the other. It's not doing both. So when you get this, then not only do you now fail to respond to insulin, and by the way, when you do a PET scan on someone, even starting in their late 20s sometimes, what do you see in early Alzheimer's and pre-Alzheimer's? You see insulin resistance. You see a reduction in glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal lobes. So that's essentially pre-Alzheimer's. Now, the second thing is, what about the ketones? Why don't you just use ketones? Well, because when the insulin is high, it prevents your body from making the ketones. So now you're kind of in the worst of both worlds, where you've got insulin resistance and you're not making ketones, and you're kind of hitting on a few cylinders. And if you're young, what you notice is you're tired, you got a little brain fog. If you're older, what you see is you actually now start declining. So even though it's not nearly as bad when you're young, it's still giving you a suboptimal situation, unfortunately. And by the way, COVID-19 is really concerning because when you look at what drives this cognitive decline, what our research showed is that it really comes, you boil it down to two major players. And yes, there are some others, but the two major players are energetics. You've got to have that, you've got to have enough energy. That's why exercise is so important. That's why sleep is so important. That's why appropriate food is so important. So it's energetics, which is oxygen, cerebral blood flow, mitochondrial function, ketone level. Those are the critical pieces to that. And then it's ongoing inflammation. And what's really interesting is that the amyloid that we vilify in Alzheimer's disease is part of your innate immune system's memory. So it is really part of your body saying, I'm being insulted. I'm being assaulted by, it can be by changes in my oral microbiome, by changes in my gut microbiome, by chronic systemic inflammation, by an infection, a Lyme disease, for example, that I may not know I have. All these things can affect your brain. In fact, many of them actually get into your brain. Herpes simplex, another common one, literally climbs up into the ganglion and then can go up into the brain. So your brain is responding to these things. That's why you have the amyloid. It's not there to give you Alzheimer's. It's there to fight these insults. But when you keep on insulting it again and again and again for years and years, it says, okay, I'm going to shift my mode from making and storing memories and making new synapses. I'm going to shift my mode to protection. I'm going to use my resources for fighting a war, a battle. And in so doing, I'm going to have to atrophy a little bit. I'm going to have to pull back a little to survive. Well, okay, that's that's not what we want. We want to get you back to the other side. To do that, we need to get rid of these various insults. Therefore, we have to look at them, find them, address them. So those are the two big players. And you can, again, look at these various things and so that you can actually impact them ahead of time.
Wow. I've never heard it explained like that. That was very clear and very frightening. So I appreciate the description. Like, that's incredible. And so you've touched a little bit, I've heard you talk about mold before, and you talked a little bit about microbiome. Could you explain a little bit more about that, maybe? Because I think that's one that a lot of us are so unaware of, and maybe it being in our environment. And then once it's in our bodies, it seems pretty hard to get out.
Yeah, this, I have to say, I wish this were not a problem, but you can't ignore reality. Unfortunately, it's there. So, we humans have made a lot of assumptions over the years. Of course, 100 years ago, the assumption was that it was okay to smoke because it really didn't do that much to you. Of course, that became very clear that that was not okay, and that's impacted us in many ways. We didn't know that eating a ton of junk food was so bad for you until people started doing the follow-ups and all the heart disease that people saw, and the high cholesterols and the hypertension and all this sort of stuff. And unfortunately, one of the assumptions that was made over the years is that we could build houses that people would live in, and it was not a big deal if you used wood that was moist, or if you had some water intrusion into your house. It happens to everybody. There's a little mold. Who cares? You can kind of coexist with mold. Well, sometimes you can, but unfortunately, in some people, their response to mold and the toxins that these molds produce. I mean, they're just trying to defend themselves. They're saying, hey, I'm being assaulted. Here's what I can do to respond. And so they make mycotoxins. And typically these things are to kill bacteria so that they can live when bacteria grow much faster than the molds. So the molds have to say, okay, how are we going to not get squeezed out here? I mean, that's where penicillin came from, obviously. Well, unfortunately, some of these mycotoxins are very damaging to humans. Number one, they can cause Alzheimer's. They can cause cognitive decline. And I reported that way back in 2015. Number two, they can cause, in some cases, cancers. Number three, they can cause other diseases, basically of toxicity. And they can cause chronic inflammation. And so Dr. Richie Shoemaker described what he calls CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So as I mentioned earlier, you can think of Alzheimer's as being two issues. Either you're failing with energetics or you're failing because you've got too much inflammation, or both. And for many people, it's some of both. And so one of the best ways, if you want to trigger, if I want to say, okay, Josh, I'm going to make your body be inflamed every day. Okay, I stick you in a house that's full of mold and mycotoxins, and they just keep triggering it. And unfortunately, another way to trigger this is to get COVID or to continue to get booster after booster after booster. And we do see, unfortunately, there's no, people always say I'm a pro-vaxxer or an anti-vaxxer, whatever they are. The reality is neither's perfect. There's no right and wrong answer here. For some people, one works better. For some people, the other works better. And so it's really a choice. And so the reality is you are triggering your immune system each time you have these various insults. And unfortunately, mycotoxins are a pretty common insult because they are so common in houses. And interestingly, some people seem to just handle them very well. They excrete them, they metabolize them, even though they're in fairly high levels, they do just fine. Other people are really in tough shape. And in fact, you see this all the time where there'll be, a couple of children and a couple of adults. One adult will get Alzheimer's. The other adult will be just fine. One of the children will get ADHD. Another children will get repeated pulmonary problems or a rash. And they're all exposed to these mycotoxins. So unfortunately, they are relatively common contributors to cognitive decline. And when we treat people, we look for them, and if they are present, we make sure that we detox them over time, and they do better when you detox them. And if you don't help to reduce these, they don't get better they don't get as much better.
Wow. Yeah. And do you have suggestions for someone who thinks they might have mold toxicity and to go and get testing, or some suggestions for that? Because I know two guys that got it and they nearly died, like two separate guys, and it took them ages to find a proper doctor who was like, hey dude, you have mold in your brain. Yeah. And then to actually go through that detox process, and he spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to figure this out.
Sorry to hear that.
And then he finally found a doctor who was like, this is it, and it was, thankfully set him on the right path, but it was arduous. And he was a skeleton, basically.
And how's he doing now?
He's so much better. Yeah. That doctor thankfully set him on the right path.
They adjusted, and I mean, that's the acid test. Did you find it, replace it, and did they, deal with it, and did they actually get better? That's the key. So that's good news. And there are some really good mold groups in Australia. And in the U.S., the U.S. probably best to look at ICI, so ISEAI, which is a group started by Mary Ackerley, fantastic physician in Arizona. And there are others, Dr. Kat Toops, Dr. Mary Kay Ross, some really fantastic physicians who deal with these mycotoxins very effectively. So if you're in the U.S., check out ISEAI. If you're in Australia, check out the mold toxicity groups. There are a couple of really good ones there.
Thank you. Yeah. And as far as our own self-induced inflammation and responses and, attacks, could you talk a little bit about stress? And, I work a lot. I love working. It's like, like maybe label me a workaholic, but I love it. I enjoy working, but sometimes I'm trying to achieve something and I push myself too hard and I feel the effects of that the next day. And, it sounds like doing that too consistently and managing that improperly is going to put me in a bad spot. Could you talk about that and maybe some ways to mitigate that? And then also how someone can enhance their ability to work more effectively?
Yeah, this is such a good point. So this really gets to the whole point of hormesis, where you are giving an insult, in this case, mild. You don't want to go over the top. So as you said, you want to work toward it. And there's some excellent talks by Dr. D.R. Clausen. So check out Dr. D.R. Clausen, Clawson, really excellent physician who talks about stress and how important it is, and what he calls the stress threat response. So it's very interesting. When your brain is looking at, are we under attack? It's not only looking at, are we under attack by bacteria, spirochetes, molds, various other fungi and viruses and all these things. It's also looking at, are we under mental attack and are we under stress, whether it's physical stress or mental stress. And you kind of alluded a bit to the physical stress, but they're both important. And when you have this, what's happening is your amygdala is responding to this. And again, is saying, okay, we're not in a situation where things are good, where we can make new memories and build our brain. We're actually in a situation where we have to go into this protective downsizing mode. So actually, in our trials, one of the things we do is to decrease stress. So what we're doing now is we're sending messages to the brain to say, not only are we going to get rid of these various toxins and infections that are assaulting you, but we're also going to lower your stress level. So basically, you can go into a more relaxed mode and you can go back into a building mode. Again, if you're going to now get your career together and add new things and do new things and network and do the things that you're trying to do, you can't do that if you're under 24/7 assault. If you're now trying to shoot various people that are trying to kill you, you just can't do those things. So you kind of have to choose one or the other, and that's why we want to get rid of all these assaults. We want to allow the brain to be building again. And so people will use everything from looking at HRV, meditation, Shinroku or Shinrin-yoku as they call it as well, which is this Japanese forest bathing, music. So there was just a nice article that came out looking at many music studies. And what they found was overall, they actually improved cognition with these music studies. And interestingly, the only ones that didn't show it were the ones where, number one, you didn't use music from that person's period. People tend to respond to music from when they were young, or number two, if you didn't have them kind of get involved. So you want them to be active. You want them to dance or to clap their hands or to be responding to this. But if they did those two things, all the other studies showed improvements in cognition. So there's no question that these are stimulating positive things. Now you were alluding a little bit to some physical activity, and you're absolutely right. You don't go from sitting on the couch to doing a triathlon. As you well know, I always say biological systems were not meant to function in square wave jerks. You don't go from 0 to infinity. So what you want to do is build up to it and let your body tell you how quickly to build up to it. And I think you're an expert in this. You know what it took you to do the mountain climbing that you do, to do this amazing stuff that you're doing. You worked up to it. And so you want to do that. And then once you're there, yes, you can continue to peak and continue to improve. And again, same thing with coming down. You don't want to cold turkey things. If you've started, whether it's a medication, whatever it is, you don't want to cold turkey, whether it's a supplement, you don't want to cold turkey that. Again, because you want to get your system to improve. And, to some extent, you are supporting stem cells that are supporting you. And of course, in the long run, for some people who have cognitive decline, getting stem cells, whether they get them from their own so-called ADRCs, from their adipose-derived stem cells, or whether they're getting them from another person, for example, cord blood-related cells, these can be very helpful. Unfortunately, what they're doing is people are doing trials with this as a monotherapy. The problem, again, is this is a network. It's kind of like saying our government is not doing well. What one person can we change? What one congressman can we replace that will change everything? It doesn't work that way. You have to look at the society. You have to look at all the different players, and that's exactly what we are doing with cognition. We're looking at all the players that tie into this beautiful this beautiful balance, and that we can now attack and improve.
Absolutely. Can you think of a time or a moment where you made some changes in your own life that really elevated your cognitive performance?
Well, I didn't know a lot of this before, so I wasn't doing a lot of the things, and so certainly, when I used to go to various, medical talks and things, what did people do to get you to come to the talk? They would put out cookies or they'd put out pizza, and so definitely hurting myself, but definitely, I've noticed. My wife and I have both made big changes to our diets. For example, I'm now 71, so we're making changes to the things we're doing. Yeah, and it's interesting. Now, I spent too much time in the sun as a kid in the surf club, so I've got bad sun damage. But for example, my hair has not turned yet. I mean, I'm kind of waiting for it, which hasn't happened yet. I'm sure it'll happen at some point.
Mine looks
But
like
so
it's
far,
going faster than yours.
so so far so good. So it hasn't gone gray, and I'm sure it will. So what we found though is I had some hypertension, and when we basically went to a lower carb diet, and when we went to, it turns out I was magnesium deficient. So a lot of people are magnesium deficient, zinc deficient, choline deficient, a common one. And by the way, choline really good for cognition because of the acetylcholine, um, and and of course iodine deficient for many people as well. And then potassium. Those are the big five. And so making those changes, the hypertension went away. So that's been helpful. I'm dealing with some other issues. I unfortunately had to have surgery, which I hadn't had since I was 11 years old this summer. So I'm still kind of getting better from that. But definitely changing some of these things, getting a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet, very helpful. Doing exercise, really, really helpful. Improving your sleep. As many physicians, I had a lifetime of lousy sleep. Working as an intern and resident, where I'd stay up for 2, 3 days in a row without any sleep. I mean, that was horrible, and really, bad for your health. So, in trying to make sure to get good sleep, I track my own sleep, as many people do. I look to see, did I get an hour of deep sleep last night? Did I get at least an hour and a half of REM sleep last night? And did I get at least 7 hours of total sleep last night? Those are all good parameters to keep. And then I look at my heart rate variability. And it's really interesting. Just doing 1 minute of deep breathing can change it from 25 or 30 to 120. So just dramatic improvements. And so looking at your heart rate variability, essentially your vagal tone, very, very helpful. The great news, Josh, is 10 years ago, even 15 years ago, everybody accepted the fact that there was nothing that could be done about your likelihood of getting Alzheimer's, about your own cognition. Oh yeah, take a supplement. Most of these were garbage. Now there is a huge amount. The armamentarium is amazing, and we recognize the role of toxin exposures. We recognize the roles of your microbiome, your gut microbiome, your oral and sinus microbiome. We recognize the roles of viral diseases like COVID and like herpes simplex. We recognize all these things, leaky gut, sleep apnea, all these sorts of things. And the great news is there's something to address every single one of them. Even hormonal changes that people have. So all these things are critical. You've really got an armamentarium like never before. And so, you can just be like a hot sports car and just optimize things from when you're in your 20s and never have to worry about this problem.
Yeah, I'd love to ask, like, for example, in Canada, it's really, really hard to find a doctor. Like, I was living there for 5 years, and it's like really hard to find a private doctor to go to. And so, you kind of end up on this waiting list, and then you finally get to somebody, and you're like, oh, can I do, XYZ blood test, listening to someone like you? And the doctor's like, you don't need to do that. Yeah. What suggestions would you have if you had like just a top tier list for someone to go, hey, no, I really want these, and to get some good guidance when they maybe don't have the choice of just going and finding a private doctor or getting to, each country has different restrictions and recommendations. Like, what would you suggest?
It's such a good point. So, I mean, the easy thing to do, if they're, look it up. You can either look at the functional medicine group, so IFM, Institute for Functional Medicine, and look up who is trained in your area. Or you can also go to ours, which is RICO. You can go to literally just look at my cognoscopy. So we recommend that everybody who is 40 or over, and again, if there's a history of dementia, I would move it to 35, get a cognoscopy. It's easy. And I have to say, it's much more pleasant to have a cognoscopy than it is to have a colonoscopy. So having had both of those, much easier. So, and that's basically three things. And you can look up mycognoscopy.com. You can get some simple blood tests, and you can look and see what doctors are near you that have been trained. So we've trained over 2,000 doctors in 10 different countries, including Canada, and all over the U.S. And you can look to see, who is close by and who's trained and who's doing the right things. And by the way, we're also now training, we've trained neuropsychologists and health coaches and nursing practitioners, all this, but we're now training dentists as well because they are really realizing that a lot of what drives cognitive change is living in your mouth. It's the mercury that's there. It's do you have gingivitis? It's what happened to your microbiome. It's do you have enough airway that you're actually getting enough oxygenation at night. We see people who don't realize they're dropping their oxygen saturation, which should be up in the 96 to 98%. They're dropping down to 85 or even 75 while they're sleeping at night. That is not good for you. And on the other side of that, Josh, have you ever done EWAT?
No, I don't.
So that's exercise with oxygen therapy. Now, the good news is you're obviously doing a lot of this by the amazing climbs you're doing. But the idea here is the opposite. We're trying to increase your oxygenation while you're working out. So you're really getting oxygenation while you've got great blood flow to the far reaches of your brain. And that is such a fantastic thing. Now, at 30, you don't have to worry about that as much. But if you're over 50, it's something to think about. So what you're doing is you're now saying, okay, I'm going to make sure to get optimal oxygenation. And in fact, going up and down gives you the best of both worlds because on the upside, you're delivering the oxygen and the blood flow. On the downside, you don't want to do too low, but when you have mild, like when you're doing some climbing, or at altitude, then what happens there is your body is responding by making trophic factors that are trying to say, wait a minute now, don't lose these synapses, let's keep them going. Now, you don't want to stay in that situation. You don't want to go and live at 10,000 feet or 20,000 feet, obviously, for years. You want to make it so that you have exposure and then you come back. That's back to hormesis. Hormesis is really interesting, and it's pushing your body to respond. But again, you don't want to go so far that it can't respond, which is why you don't want to go from 0 to a marathon right away, work up to it. And you don't want to keep it there for a long time. You want to hit it and then come back and hit it, which is, again, why exercising has been so helpful for so many people. And we do have people, by the way, who will kind of under-exercise. We'll say, look, you have some cognitive decline. It's not too bad yet. We can reverse it, no problem. Let's do this. And they say, well, I'm just going to walk a little bit. No, you got to get your heart rate up. You got to get the oxygenation up, which is why I love EWAT. You get the heart rate up, you get the blood flow up, you get the oxygenation up.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. I'd love to talk more about the oral piece because I think that what shocked me so much was, I'll just share a little story. When I was in Nepal, I didn't realize, but I caught a tapeworm, and I had this tapeworm grow, obviously, to the point where it was releasing all these mycotoxins, and I had no idea what was going on. I was having insomnia. I was like, my life was falling apart, like literally. Yeah. And once we, figured it out by looking in the back of the toilet one day and seeing a skin,
wow.
It was horrific,
horrific,
dude. And then, going through that detoxing phase and stuff like that, I had like 2 fillings to that point. And then in 18 months, I had 14 cavities because the bacteria had changed, like as you imagine, in my stomach and my mouth. And so I'd had 2 fillings like until that point. And I was 23. And then within a year, 14 cavities. It was wild, and just from that complete change in my body. So I'd love, do you mind just elaborating a bit more on the importance of oral health and that sort of stuff? Because we often think of it, scrub your teeth, do some flossing.
Here's the great news. Again, there's a lot you can do about this that you couldn't even do 5 or 10 years ago. Number one, you can check your oral microbiome. There are a couple of groups that do that, and one of them, for example, is Oral DNA. They'll tell you whether you have more on the pathogen side or whether you have more on the non-pathogen side. Secondly, you can improve your oral microbiome, and you can do it in a couple ways. Dental Sidon is a compound which actually kills a lot of the pathogens. Now, the negative of it, it can kill some of the non-pathogens, but it tends to kill the pathogens better. And then the good news is there are now oral probiotics. So you can, things like Revitin is one of the examples. And again, the dental practitioners are becoming more oral systemic practitioners. They're looking at the fact that, guess what? Is what's in your mouth affects whether you're going to have cardiac disease. It affects whether you're going to have dementia. It affects even cancer likelihood, cancer risk. So these pathogens in your mouth play very important roles in your overall health. And it's interesting, in your case, it's likely that what happened is you got some of the pathogens, unfortunately, and you probably did change things when you were treating your tapeworm as well. And so now you were in a situation where you were having, unfortunately, more of this. So yeah, you're right. It's not just about brushing and flossing. It is also about looking at, gingivitis, looking at your oral microbiome, and using the microbiome as a positive, just as you do in your gut. Putting in the good guys is excluding the bad guys. If you don't have the good guys, the bad guys go crazy, right? So you can now do this with this combination. So I would look at your oral microbiome, try some dentalcidin, and then follow it up with Revitin, so that you can actually get some of the positives, the good guys, in your oral microbiome.
Wow. Yeah, I was really lucky, to be honest with you. I found a holistic dentist in Vancouver.
Yeah.
Within 5 minutes, she was looking at my mouth, less than 5 minutes, and she was like, "Have you ever had like any problems with your bacteria or anything like that in your stomach?" I was like, "Yeah, I've got a parasite." And she was just like, "I had a parasite," and she was like, "That's where this is from." And they did what you said.
Wow.
They got me to do the clean out. They filled the cavities, and then I had oral, and I haven't had cavities since. I had oral probiotics, and it was just like
Yep.
game changer. Whereas
Yep.
my
You
mouth was
fixed the
literally
oral
like
microbiome.
getting eaten alive, on the inside. It was frightening, very frightening. So
Congratulations.
yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Thanks for some good help. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does it cause, like you said, cardiac disease, dementia, cancer? How does this come from our mouth? Is it the same theory, like idea as what you talked about before? It's an overload and then your brain starts to shut down, or these things start to
Yeah.
shut down, or is there something else going on?
Yeah. So there are a couple of mechanisms. One of the things which is kind of remarkable, the neuropathologists look in the brains of patients with cognitive decline, and what they're actually finding, bacteria, they're finding these fungi, they're finding these different pathogens, and of course they're finding herpes, both HSV1 and other, for example, HHV6A is another one. It's another human herpes virus. So these things do work their way into your brain. The second thing, of course, is you can mess up your barrier by getting gingivitis. So now you've got essentially a free ride from the mouth to the blood. And now we always think about this blood-brain barrier. Isn't that going to exclude all these pathogens? That was the thought. And encourage you to take a look at a paper that was published just a couple of years ago on Candida. What they did was they took rodents, but they said, okay, they have a blood-brain barrier just like humans do. We're going to see how long the blood-brain barrier excludes this yeast, this Candida, because Candida are common. People get it all the time. And let's see how. And they thought, is it going to be a month? Is it going to be a year? It turned out to be about 5 minutes. So these pathogens, unfortunately, have worked out ways to get across the blood-brain barrier. Again, it's horrifying, but the good news is we can find them, we can treat them, and we can reduce the likelihood of getting in there, partly by just improving your immune system. And you can now start to see why the amyloid that is there in the brains of Alzheimer's patients, which people thought for years that's causing the disease, you can now see why it's there. It is responding to these things. And by the way, that's what they found. When the Candida worked its way into the brain, the response of the brain looked like the very beginnings of Alzheimer's disease. So again, you're responding to these insults. And the good news, your body can respond to a lot of insults. But when you haven't turned the insults off, I mean, imagine that you hadn't treated the tapeworm and you hadn't treated the cavities. Look what shape you'd be in now. You identified them, you addressed them, you're doing great. But that's what's happening in these Alzheimer's patients. Nobody is identifying the problem and addressing the problem. So it just keeps going downhill, downhill, downhill. So you mentioned, all these things. So yes, what's happening is they're actually finding the organisms in the brain, interestingly, in cancers and in the lesions in cardiovascular disease. So these things are seeding the bloodstream all the time. Now, most of the time, you're fighting them, you're doing well, but occasionally, again, this is why you want to keep healthy and keep your immune system doing well. They will now infect and inflame an area. And so then you got to come along and you'll now develop some cardiac disease, for example, or you'll now develop Alzheimer's because you're responding to the invasion of these insults.
Wow. That's incredible. Frightening. Incredibly frightening. Incredibly frightening, and like really, because immediately makes me think of things swimming around in my blood, which is the
Yeah.
reality,
Well, things are swimming around in your blood. The great news is you're a really healthy guy and you're going to prevent them from giving you problems, hopefully till you're 100. And of course, people are now saying, well, let's live to 140. And so I always ask people, well, would you like to live to 140? And they say yes. And I say, and spend 70 of those years in a nursing home with dementia? No. So, we want to make sure whether you live to 100 or 140 or whatever, make sure that you keep sharp, make sure that you keep your mental abilities good. And you can do that by addressing these things and identifying. Get a cognoscopy, get on appropriate prevention or earliest reversal. That's the other big thing. Oh my gosh, this whole field has been backward and upside down because what do doctors say? Oh, Josh, you're having a little problem. It's probably okay. Come back next year. Well, they keep telling you that, and then they finally say, oh, it's Alzheimer's, and it's pretty late stage now, so there's nothing we can do. So you don't want to wait. You want to get in on active prevention or earliest reversals. When you develop Alzheimer's disease, and again, many people will have pre-Alzheimer's, even early 20s, 30s, 40s. So when you develop this, you go through 4 phases. You go through the first phase, which is where you're asymptomatic. Everything seems fine, but you can already show on PET scans or you can show on spinal fluid. And the great news now on simple blood tests like phospho-tau and GFAP, you can see that things are beginning to change already, even though I don't feel it. Okay, great. That's the time to get in there and start treating them. The second phase is called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. And that's your typical late 30s, early 40s, something who's saying, my mind is just not what it used to be. I'm not remembering phone numbers the way I used to. I'm not as sharp as, but my doctor told me, I'm now 40, So again, that shouldn't happen. You should be doing very well. And so you want to get checked out then. That is subjective cognitive impairment. The great news is that lasts about 10 years. So you have a huge opportunity to make sure that you never have significant cognitive decline. Now, the third of 4 stages is what's been called mild cognitive impairment. As one of my patients said, nobody should have called this mild. There's nothing mild about it. And unfortunately, it was called mild cognitive impairment. It should be called relatively late stage Alzheimer's disease because it's the third of 4 stages. It's like telling someone, please don't worry, Josh, you just have mildly metastatic cancer. It's a late problem of what's going to become dementia. Now, the good news about MCI is that it still is reversible. In many cases, we got, as I said, 84% of these. We took just the 3rd and 4th stages for the trial. The first two you can do great. It's actually fairly easy if you do the right thing to do very, very well. And so the MCI, by definition, that means now you're starting to not do well on cognitive tests. Whereas with SCI, you can still perform on cognitive tests and still get in the normal range. Even though maybe for you, it's not normal, you're still doing it, you can hang in there. MCI, now you're starting to fail the tests, but you're still able to care for yourself. The 4th and final phase is dementia, where not only are you failing the tests, but now you're having trouble with things like paying bills, taking a shower, doing the activities of daily living, those sorts of things. And that's when people can no longer drive and things like that. So don't wait. This is so crazy that doctors have always said, oh, come back next year, it's not that bad. No, we want to do it as early as possible. Nobody should be getting to that 4th phase.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very sad. Could we touch back on the herpes thing? Because you talked about it 2 or 3 times, and I've heard people say that I mean, a common thought is you can't get rid of it. I've heard someone say they're like, it comes when I'm stressed out. Like I take an antiviral, then wait for it to go, and then it only comes when I'm stressed. They might get a sore or whatever.
Yep.
Can you get rid of it? I don't know too much about it because I've never had it, but I know some people that have it. And
Yeah, and it's relatively common, as you know. And there was an amazing study from Taiwan a number of years ago where they looked at people who, at midlife, treated their outbreaks versus those who didn't treat their outbreaks. And the ones who treated their outbreaks had a dramatically lower risk for developing Alzheimer-related dementia. So yeah, the bottom line turns out to be that you should treat your outbreaks. And the good news is there are lots of ways to do that. I mean, people can do it a fairly natural way by using things like lysine. But you can also do things like valaciclovir, which is a wonderful drug. It's one of the drugs that is really benign. It really works against the virus and has very little impact on your own cells. So people will take it for years for suppression. But for the people you were mentioning, okay, take it as early as possible. Usually you can have a little sensation that it's coming, or I've been under stress, or I've been out on the sun too much. Okay, take it then. Take it for a week, take it for 2 weeks. We have people that have done suppression taking it for 10 years and haven't had major problems. And it is one of the ones that can create this chronic inflammatory syndrome in your brain. Professor Ruth Itzhaki has spent her whole career looking at the relationship between herpes simplex and Alzheimer's disease, and more recently other herpes as well. And she argues that this is a very common contributor to Alzheimer's disease. And there are other infectious ones. Again, anything that gives you chronic inflammation. It's interesting. When people get COVID, what happens? What kills people in COVID is this phenomenon where they have cytokine storm. What happens is the virus actually participates in this itself, unfortunately. It has a mechanism molecularly where it prevents you from making the interferon that you need to make to deal with it early on. So your body kind of goes along thinking it doesn't have it, and then suddenly, boom, oh yeah, it's big. So what happens? Your body makes all these cytokines, which then, because they're responding to this, can unfortunately actually kill you. You die by cytokine storm. So at that point, you actually want to tone down the response. Well, Alzheimer's, the same thing. You have a chronic, in this case, instead of acute, it's chronic. And so you die by cytokine drizzle rather than cytokine storm. Instead of this big storm, it's this little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit for years, pulling back, pulling back, pulling back, pulling back. Okay, we can deal with that. Get it early, find out what's causing this, and now reverse the problem.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some suggestions for someone who's kind of working out 5-6 days a week? They're pretty relatively healthy, but they're kind of like, man, I feel like I could be doing better, or I could be sharper. I could work more. I feel like I'm not as sharp as I used to be. And they're not in that 35 to 40 bracket. They're still in that younger bracket. What would be kind of do you have a handful?
Oh yeah,
list
absolutely.
Of 1 to 5 things that would really help.
So lots you can do, in fact. Number one would be check your metabolic status. As I said earlier, you can develop insulin resistance when you're 5 years old. So for some of these people, they'll have insulin resistance. For some, they won't. Second thing, check your genetics. Everybody should know their ApoE status, for example. And that's easy to do. You can do it over 23andMe, for example. There are others as well. Because 3/4 of the population is ApoE4 negative. So the common ones are ApoE2, 3, and 4. This is a protein that carries lipids. So we like to say it's kind of like your butcher. It's the guy that carries the fat around, and one of them. There are several others as well. Why would that have anything to do with Alzheimer's? And we published a number of years ago and found in our research something really interesting. This thing binds to a receptor, with that had been known, but it actually enters the nucleus and it changes the programming of your cells. ApoE4 is the one that increases your risk for Alzheimer's. It changes your body to a more pro-inflammatory state. So again, it goes exactly with what you and I have been talking about. When you're responding to these insults with a hyper immune response, you're going to make more amyloid. You're going to have more problems. You're going to have more inflammation and more Alzheimer's. Now, ApoE3 is the more common one. For example, I checked myself. I'm an ApoE3/3. That's the most common. My risk as a 3/3 is about 9% for my lifetime. It's not zero, but it's not super high. If you have a single copy of ApoE4, and that's a quarter of the population, so it's about 75 million US citizens. Now let's see, what's the current population of Canada? It must be like, what,
I've already left. Couldn't tell
40
you.
million? Where are you now?
I'm in Colombia, in Medellin.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. So if you look at US, for example, you're looking at about 75 million Americans. Your risk is 30% if you have one copy. And there's a wonderful website started by a woman with two copies, Julie G, which is called apoe4.info. Great thing to know about. So if you're a 20-something and you just found out you're ApoE4 positive, don't even waste 2 seconds worrying about it. You can make sure that you're not going to get Alzheimer's. Get on the right stuff. Check apoe4.info. Check my cognoscopy. Now, if you have two copies, that's 7 million Americans. So not too many, but it's still 7 million. Your risk during your entire lifetime is about 70%. Most likely you will develop Alzheimer's. Well, okay, don't worry. Get you on. And Julie G is a great example. She actually she had symptoms in her late 40s, found out she was ApoE4/4, and two copies, got on the protocol. She's now 11 years on, doing great. And she actually started this on her own and then discovered the work we were doing. And she's done great. And interestingly, she had a couple of times when she had a little bit of backsliding. We looked at what it was. She found out in one case it turned out to be that she was infected with babesia, which is from tick bites. In another case, it turned out to be mycotoxins. And she's addressed these. She's done absolutely great. Her test scores have gone from 35th percentile to the 98th percentile. She is sharp as a tack. She wrote part of the second book with me, The End of Alzheimer's program. After the first one I wrote was called The End of Alzheimer's. So she's done great, and that's a good resource for anybody. So again, 20-something, find out and don't worry about it. And then get on some brain training. Now, if you're working 24/7 and you're learning new languages and stuff like that, and doing Sudoku or things like that, don't worry about it. But for many people, if you're not doing those things, just do some brain training. There's some really good ones, whether you like Brain HQ, whether you like Elevate, whether you like, there are a couple of other ones. What is it? Dakim is another one. And now the good news about Brain HQ is that it actually has some very strong science behind it. Professor Mike Mersnick he's the father of brain training, won the Kavli Prize for his tremendous neuroscience studies. And he's developed this so that people actually enhance their cognition. So again, you want to do the other things right so that you can now work with your cognition itself. They've worked with Tom Brady, for example, all sorts of people to improve. And in fact, Tom Brady said it was his work on cognition that helped him have better visual field and helped him do better with his passing. So, now to be fair, he wasn't a 20-something at that time. He was now, an early 40-something. But that sort of training can be helpful for any age. And so I would encourage people, do that sort of training. Absolutely, it can help you optimize your brain function. No question.
Love that. And I'd love to know, if you were looking back over, the last 10, 20 years, like, what are you really proud of that you've done that you feel like has made a big...
So I would say what I'm proud of is that I haven't backed down from the truth. When we first discovered how this all worked and we first started seeing people get better, I had responses like, the drug companies will never go for this. You got to find something that's just one thing, not a whole series of things. It can't be a protocol. It's got to be, because you'll make money that way. You'll be able to sell a bunch of one thing. I've never used that. We've had only, once we kind of understood this, we've had only one thing, which is what's the best outcome we can get. And for young people, for middle-aged people, and for old people. And so I am proud of the fact that, and I have to say, I've been hounded. Many of my old colleagues literally will not talk to me because I'm saying, look, I'm sorry, but your research is wrong. You're trying to give a single drug for Alzheimer's that doesn't work. In the long run, these targeted drugs with the precision medicine protocols are likely to be the best way to go. But the idea of using these as monotherapies, it just doesn't work. The data show you the best you can do is slightly slow the decline in the early stages. That's a horrible result. We can do far, far better. So I would say that's the one thing. I have to say, it's been painful because we've had a lot of naysayers, but we've always stuck with that one thing, which is what's the best outcome we can get.
So Dale, how did you respond when you got the negative feedback? It sounds like you started to pull on the truth and then it turned into something bigger than you ever expected.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I got an email, I don't know, it was about a year ago, from an excellent researcher who had simply quoted our papers and had been hounded on Twitter. These people saying the fact that you quoted this guy, is horrible. This guy's a charlatan. It's so ridiculous. And we're publishing data in peer-reviewed journals that's showing people getting better. They say it's impossible, and you got to use a drug, and we got to keep at this. So yes, we absolutely are kind of pulling a string, and we keep seeing. Oh, wait a minute! And as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're now looking at other neurodegenerative diseases with the idea that there's really a unified theory here, that these diseases all represent different neural subnetworks that each has its own supply and demand. And in each case, you've got too little supply or too much demand or both. And so you're now seeing this involutional process. And so if we can identify these things and address them, we should be able to prevent and reverse all of these diseases. Now, that's what this new department is going to be doing. We'll see over the next several years if that's what happens. But absolutely, we keep pulling and things keep coming out, but people keep pushing back and saying, okay, the first thing was you just published 10 cases. We don't believe it. Then we published another 10 cases with more documentation. Okay, that's still not enough. Okay, so then we published 100 cases. Then they say, okay, but we want a trial. Then we published a trial. Then they said, yeah, but we want a randomized controlled trial. Okay, that's what we're doing now. And you know what? When we publish that, they'll say, now we want something else because there's just going to be more. The reality is anyone who has used this or been on it can see the results. And doctors tell me this all the time. I didn't believe it at the beginning. We started treating patients. We started seeing people get better. And now we believe it. And then we wrote about this in the First Survivors of Alzheimer's. So I think, people should see it for themselves. And by the way, the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings that you're talking about, see for yourself how good your cognition is when you are doing the right things, when you've made sure you don't have insulin resistance, made sure that you don't have a high HSCRP, which is a simple way to look at inflammation. And they're now getting some better and better inflammation markers, so that as these things come along, there's going to be more and more we can do. And yes, people always say, oh, well, just eat right. Well, okay, it's not that simple. There are many, many things that you can actually look at, just as we are, using computational approaches to look at where you shop, what you're doing. I mean, look how much Google knows about your behavior and my behavior. Why aren't we using these same sorts of algorithms to look at all the beauty of physiology? Physiology is very complicated, human physiology. And this old idea that doctors have, come to my office when you're feeling bad and I'll write you a prescription. That is 20th century thinking. That's done. We now need to be able to do this. And by the way, I would say, Josh, by the end of this century, there should be virtually no Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lewy body, but also very little schizophrenia, very little ADHD, very little autism, because these are all turning out to be network dysfunctions, where instead of looking at a single thing, a simple disease like pneumococcal pneumonia, we're now going to be able to look at the networks and say, okay, each of these, there's something we can do about each of these.
Wow. Do you have any words towards someone who is in that 25 to 35 range? They're pushing, they're trying to get after it. Just a few words of advice for them as we wrap up.
Yeah, I would say the first thing if I took myself back when I was 25, I was a third year medical student. And I would say when you're young, the tendency is to abuse your body because you can. You go to a parties all night. So, you're doing drugs in some cases. You're doing all these things that are really not good for your future because you can, and you can still get up the next morning and feel great. But I think we are slowly changing to realize, hey, even though the diagnosis of these chronic illnesses was 20 years, 30 years later, you're beginning to make those biochemical changes early. So do the things, even though it might not seem that you need to at 25. Check your sleep, check your heart rate variability. And by the way, I think that wearables are one of the most important things for developing for the long run. That's what's going to allow your generation to be really healthy to 100 plus, because you don't have to wait. I didn't know my heart rate variability when I was 25. I didn't know my telomere length. I didn't know my gut microbiome. I didn't know my oral microbiome. I didn't know if I had sleep apnea, any of these things. So now being able to do this, CGM, great thing, continuous glucose monitoring, very helpful. You may find that you're skyrocketing your glucose. You may also find that you're waking up in the middle of the night because you're now getting some hypoglycemia. We see this all the time, even in the 20-somethings and 30-somethings. So I would say for those who are 25, let's make sure you have at least 75 more really good years with great cognition. Let's make sure that you don't ever have to worry about Alzheimer's or other neurodegenerative diseases. And for anyone who's seen other neurodegenerative diseases, these things are all horrible. Nobody wants a corticobasal degeneration or Parkinson's or any of these horrible things, progressive supranuclear palsy. I mean, these are horrible things to have. The great news is your generation should be able to avoid them the vast majority of cases. Now, maybe you're going to, by the time you get there, maybe it's going to be 110, 120, maybe it's going to be 160 with all the cellular reprogramming. Don't know yet. That's going to be really interesting to see. But so take good care of yourself, use your wearables, see where you stand with your insulin, see where you stand with your gut health, see where you stand with your chronic inflammation. These are all things that can happen even before teens. See where you stand if you are dropping your oxygen at night. See whether your airway's okay. These are things that are easy to do now that can buy you decades of great health on the other end.